I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Focus of what brings us here today is this Eaton fire, very large but particularly catastrophic fire in Southern California in the Altadena area, coupled with the Palisades fire, particularly of interest to those of you in Brentwood. Do I still have your attention?
You do?
Yes.
Okay. And what was critically important about these fires, not their large size, not the fact that we had unusual conditions, but they were so destructive. And we haven't seen this sort of destruction since the 1961 Bel Air fire, which some of you may remember because it was sometimes described as the Bel Air Brentwood fire. And this was extremely destructive at the time, 500 homes destroyed, but now we're an order of magnitude higher than that in terms of losses. So the current fires are of particular concern. And one of the first things to note about these fires is they were unusual, but they were not unique. What was unusual about them is a 9-month drought, extreme Santa Ana winds, and most importantly, a human ignition. Without that human ignition, we simply don't get these big fires. What was unique about them was the amount of destruction, and that's something we'll touch on in a minute. Now, the media has often reported in recent weeks that these winter wildfires are totally unheard of. That's simply not the case. Southern California has had at least a half a dozen very large fires during the winter, some of them in the Santa Monica Mountains, the 1956 Zuma fire, the 1958 Malibu fire, and the Thomas fire, and as well as the Woolsey fire. So we have had unique events in the past. One of the things that has been pointed out as critically important to understanding the severity of the recent fires is the 9-month drought. But it's important to realize all of our big fires are preceded by extended periods of drought. And this is just a list of large fires in Southern California going back 100 years. The ones in red are ones that occurred during Santa Ana wind conditions. The ones in black, non-Santa Ana wind conditions. The important thing to recognize is 9-month drought is not an excessively long drought period prior to one of these big fires. The record being the Thomas fire, 72 months of drought prior to the Thomas fire. Also, it's important to recognize that the fuel conditions due to this drought were very low, but they're low every year on average in the autumn and winter. This solid line here shows the fuel level, the live fuel moisture level in a collection of the average of a long-term record. And it shows that on average, all years are low during the autumn. Usually they rise in the winter because of rainfall. This year they didn't rise. But the critically important factor is the Santa Ana winds. And these are the result of a high pressure cell that develops east of California in the Great Basin, coupled with a low pressure cell. And air moves from high pressure to low pressure. And you can see that we get this offshore flow. And here it's illustrated by smoke columns coming from fires in 2003. Normally, the Santa Ana winds, which are illustrated by these bars here, are present in the most frequent month for Santa Ana winds is the autumn months of October and November. Generally, they tail off in December. We still get them in January all the way through spring, but summer we don't have Santa Ana winds. Normally, they're a danger in terms of fire because these dotted lines here indicate our normal drought period. But in this case, that drought period extended all the way into the end of December and January. So Santa Ana winds in the autumn are usually followed by following drought conditions. And that makes them particularly concerning in terms of fires. They're not unique. We get them every single year. This is a 25-year record here in the bottom, showing Santa Ana wind events going back to 1980. Every year we get Santa Ana wind events, primarily in the autumn and early winter. What was important to recognize about the winds this year is they were very extreme. Normally, moderate Santa Ana winds, which you can see here in this left panel, and this is blue, is showing the early part of record, 1948 to 1983. The red is showing the more recent period. But the bottom line is most of the Santa Ana winds are what we call moderate winds, and that means they're 30 to 40 mile per hour winds. But we have in the past gotten extreme wind events. They're not very frequent, but when they occur, if we look at total area burned, on average, the extreme winds are responsible for a lot of area burned. And the largest fire, if we look at just the mean area burned during an extreme wind event, this is the Thomas Fire, which was extremely large, burned under extremely severe wind conditions. Now, these extreme Santa Ana wind events are not normal, but they're not unique. This year, we got 50,000 acres burned from an extreme Santa Ana wind events in LA area. But 2017, we had extremely large extreme winds that produced 280,000 burned acres. But 2011, we had also extreme winds, 140 miles per hour recorded in 2011. Nobody started a fire during that period, and so there was no fire. Now, what is really hard for people to appreciate is how important these extreme winds are in terms of fire behavior. If you've ever been on a roller coaster and you remember being at the top of a steep descent, as you're going down, you are reaching speeds which are close to the speeds seen in these extreme wind events from these past fires. In other words, they are really, really fast. But unlike a roller coaster where the extreme speeds end after a few seconds, in the Santa Ana wind events we saw in the Eaton Fire and the Pacific Palisades Fire, those extended for much longer periods of time, coupled with the fact that there were lots and lots of embers blowing across the landscape. And this is probably the most critical element to why these fires were so destructive. Extreme speed, it lasted for extended periods of time, along with lots of embers being blown. And when those embers blow across the landscape, they produce a really formidable situation. This is just a quote from one of the Forest Service first responders talking about he had never seen in 21 years this sort of situation with these wind gusts and ember casts that impinged on structures. And when you look at the aerial imagery during some periods of these fires, you see images like this from the Eaton Fire. And one of the important things to understand about the fire is the firefighters were not fighting a fire front. They were fighting fires that occurred across many blocks and due to the embers landing on different homes. And so here we see lots and lots of different fires isolated from one another. And this is one of the reasons it was extremely difficult to fight these fires, is because they were so many different fires in different locations across the landscape. Now, let me just focus the rest of this talk on solutions for adapting to future fires. And there's been a tremendous amount of discussion in the media about what we should do and what we should have done to prevent these fires. And let me just address some of this. One in particular is the issue of fuel management. Some people have said in the media that, well, if we had been doing prescription burning of wildland fires, we never would have had this event. And this is something that requires really close scrutiny, because right now there's a tremendous amount of effort going into doing fuel management throughout the state. And the primary means of fuel management is what fire managers call prescription burning. And that is producing a fire in the vegetation during prescribed conditions that make it easy to control. And there's been a substantial amount of money in the state put into prescription burning primarily in conifer forests. It's important, though, to realize prescription burning in conifer forests is a completely different phenomenon than prescription burning in chaparral. When you burn in conifer forests, and those are mostly in the Sierra Nevada and Northern California, the fires historically have been what we call surface fires. They burn in the understory. And you can see the impact of fire management on these understory burns when you look at this record on the right. Each of the horizontal lines represents a tree, and each of the vertical lines represents a fire that was recorded from scars on that tree. And what you see is over the last 100 years, there's basically been no understory burning. These low intensity surface fires, which historically were important in those forests, they've been eliminated by fire managers. Southern California is very different. This area in the southern central part of the state dominated not by forests, but by shrublands, and they don't burn by surface fire. They burn by high intensity crown fires. And here's just an illustration of the amount of fire area burned in LA County over the last roughly 90 years. And what we see is every decade we've had lots of fires. So we've never had this hiatus in burning seen in the conifer forest. But the important thing to understand about prescription burning is it's very different in forests than it is in chaparral. This is a prescribed burn in a conifer forest. It burns in the understory. It cleans out the dead fuels in the understory, but generally doesn't affect the canopy vegetation. Here is this prescribed burn after the burn is completed, and what you see is the forest is still intact. So prescribed burning in conifer forests burns in the understory. It doesn't destroy the vegetation itself. This is completely different in chaparral. In chaparral, when we have a prescribed burn or a wildfire, they all burn as crown fires that kill all of the above ground vegetation. So prescribed burning is a very different treatment in chaparral than it is in conifer forest. And because our landscape is very rugged with lots of steep slopes, this creates potential problems due to the steepness of the slope and the fact that after a fire, we've denuded that landscape from the vegetation. This is just one illustration of what can happen when you burn a landscape and kill off all the above ground chaparral vegetation. This is the Montecito watershed after the Thomas fire in 2017, and all of the chaparral has been killed. But the following winter, we had this catastrophic debris flow and flooding, and it destroyed a lot of the homes in the Montecito area. Something like 40 people were killed by this flooding event. So doing any sort of burning in chaparral has the potential of creating landslides and debris flows. Here's another example south of Santa Barbara in an area called La Conchita, which also experienced a massive debris flow that ended up killing people in the communities below. So we need to keep in mind that prescription burning works just fine in forests. It's not necessarily the right thing to be doing in chaparral landscapes. Now, in addition to recent fires leading to slope instability, there's also a long history of high fire frequency in Southern California that contributes to what we call vegetation type conversion. And this is illustrated from Topanga Canyon. This is an area of Topanga Canyon, mature chaparral vegetation, 30 years of age. This is that same landscape after several fires in short duration, like within a decade. And what we've done is we've eliminated most of the shrub species and they're replaced with grasses. And those grasses have less holding capacity, soil holding capacity, much more vulnerable to debris flows. And in addition, the concern is when you burn chaparral frequently enough that you type convert it to grasslands, the grasslands not only don't hold slopes as well, they are the primary source for most ignitions. So when fires start in California, Southern California, most of them start in grassland areas and then spread to other vegetation types. So grasslands in of themselves may not be hazardous fuels to burn, but they contribute to slope instability as well as contribute to increased fire frequency. Now, where the recent fires, like the Eaton fire in Altadena, occurred, um, the concern about why we should have been doing fire management is that when you have shrubland vegetations around developed areas, there's concern that those shrublands may become old and full of what some people call decadent shrublands, that lots of dead fuels, and are in need of prescription burning. This certainly wasn't the case above Altadena. This is Altadena where the Eaton fire occurred. And in 2009, we have the station fire. This yellow line here shows the perimeter of the station fire. In other words, the chaparral above Altadena was not extremely old and certainly was not a contributing factor to the severity of these fires. And this is just another more detailed fire history map of the station fire. And you can see that outside that perimeter, there were also areas above Altadena that had burned within the last decade or two. So this was not a landscape full of old dead vegetation, which could account for how severe this fire event was. The Pacific Palisades, we see a similar phenomenon. This is the areas burned between 1970, 79, and then every decade since then. And what we see is we've had a fair number of fires in the past. This is not a landscape that has been missing fires and is in need of prescription burning. And what is particularly important to understand about this whole issue of doing fuel management is it's not going to solve the problem of big fires. This was a study done a number of years ago. This was prior to the Woolsey fire, but it includes the 10 largest fires in the Santa Monica Mountains prior to that time. And this is the age structure of the vegetation within those burned areas at the time of the fire. For example, a 1935 Malibu fire, 25,000 acre fire, and essentially all of the vegetation was within the 5-year age span. So this was not old vegetation. The Malibu fire didn't become a large fire because of old vegetation. And we see that pattern with a number of different fires. A lot of our fires, another one here, the 1970 Clampett fire, most of the vegetation was relatively young. So you don't have to have old vegetation to produce severe fire events. And it illustrates why doing fuel management on these landscapes is not going to solve the problem. The real problem with our Santa Ana wind-driven fires is the fuel age doesn't determine the rate of spread. It's the winds that blow embers. And this is a Santa Ana wind-driven fire. The fire actually started down here in the background area. And what you're seeing here are spot fires that have been generated by the wind. So they're carrying embers across the landscape and depositing them in areas and starting new fires. So it's not like an old vegetation that's carrying a fire front and burns into a landscape. It's that the embers are being blown across the landscape. And the impact of these embers is particularly relative to the question of fuel management is illustrated in a number of cases. This is the 2014 Carlsbad fire called the Poinsettia fire. And here you see an area where the fire basically stopped at this wall that was produced. It did scorch a little bit of the vegetation, but it didn't burn through this area meant to protect the home. But unfortunately, the home was completely destroyed. And it wasn't destroyed because there was a lack of fuel treatment around the home. It was because the embers were blown up on top of the home and ignited the home, even though the adjacent landscape was relatively untouched. Another more recent example, Laguna Niguel, the coastal fire, not a big fire, about 200 acres. And The Orange County Fire Authority considered this area to be well protected because there had been a nice fuel break that had been created below the Laguna Niguel development here. The fire burned up the slope, even though it was only a 200-acre fire, and it was the fire front was prevented from reaching the development because of this fuel break. Embers blew up above that fuel break, landed on the homes, and there was something like 20 some homes that were destroyed just due to the ember flow. So doing fuel treatments is not necessarily the way to approach the question of destruction. The other thing to recognize is once the embers reach the urban environment, and in the case of both the Eaton fire and the Pacific Palisades fire, those embers reach the developed areas very quickly, within minutes. Once they reach the developed area, the wildland fuels are irrelevant. They don't play a role in the spread of that fire. Even the vegetation growing around the homes doesn't play a critical role. This is an illustration here of the Eaton fire, and you see all these homes destroyed. They are destroyed not by fuels that carried the fire from one house to another, or wildland fuels, but by the homes themselves. Once a home is ignited, it produces extremely intense fires, and those spread from house to house. So once the fire gets started in these areas, it's an urban fire. It's not a wildland fire, and it's spread by the fuels of the homes themselves, in large part because homes represent very dry fuels. Homes are made out of dried material, and they are at equilibrium with the ambient conditions. And when you have a Santa Ana wind environment, 5% relative humidity, those homes are extremely dry and they ignite very readily. Now, before we leave this issue of fuel management, one of the things that's important to recognize is not all of our fires in Southern California occur during Santa Ana wind conditions, and fuel treatments may play a different role in different times of the year, depending on the fire. This figure here, the red, shows Santa Ana wind-driven fires based on the Julian day of the year. So 0 is January 1st and going up to the end of the year. And what we see is Santa Ana winds are in the autumn, sometimes in the winter, but much of our fire, in fact, most of the area that burns in Southern California, occurs during the summer. And these are summer fires, and they are not carried by Santa Ana winds. And this still illustrates the frequency of fires in Southern California under non-Santa Ana wind conditions. And we see that the bulk of our fires occur during the late spring, early summer conditions, and they account for a substantial amount of area burn, but they're not driven by these extreme winds. And so when we talk about how fuel treatments would play no role in Santa Ana wind-driven fires, that may not be the case with summer fires. Just to give you an illustration of the big fire events in Southern California that occurred during Santa Ana wind events versus non-Santa Ana wind events, the striped areas here show Santa Ana wind events. This big area here is the Thomas fire from 2017. The yellow indicates non-Santa Ana wind conditions. In general, Santa Ana wind-driven fires are most destructive in the coastal areas. The non-Santa Ana wind conditions fires tend to be more in the interior. Santa Monica Mountains, certainly our big fires are almost all driven by Santa Ana winds. Now, under non-Santa Ana wind conditions, there is a potential role for fuel treatments, but primarily as a way of protecting communities. Producing fuel treatments across the landscape probably isn't going to change the outcome of fires, but producing fuel breaks, for example, between the wildland areas and communities might play a role. There's a lot of focus by people who have developed or produced homes in the wildland areas to increase the amount of fuel treatments around their landscape. California law requires 100-foot clearance around homes. This is about 300-foot clearance, and it's driven primarily by the thinking that more clearance is always better. but the evidence doesn't necessarily support that. More clearance means more potential for erosion, more potential for invasive grasses that come in to fill the vacuum created by eliminating those, but also loss of natural resources. We did a study a few years ago where we looked at the change in loss of natural resources if in San Diego County, everybody at the wildland urban interface increased their clearance from 100 to 300 feet, and determined that would represent a 15% loss in natural resources. So it is a concern if you're thinking in terms of balancing fire hazard reduction with resource conservation, in particular because the studies we've done that have looked at the amount of clearance and the role it's had in homes destroyed, we see that there's definitely an important impact of clearance up to about 50 to maybe 100 feet. Beyond that, there's really no evidence that further clearance is going to change the outcome of whether or not your house is lost. And critically important is just the aesthetics. I mean, doing these sorts of fuel treatments adjacent to homes is not necessarily something that is related to why people move to wildland areas. Now, let me just summarize what I think are the most important aspects to how we should deal with wind-dominated fires. And it's what I call the 5 Ps. And the first P is people. And it's important to realize that in Southern California and throughout shrubland areas in the state, 100% of the fires are ignited by people. And increased fires since 2000, something like 6 million more people have been added to the state, which is certainly a reason why we've had more fires in the last 20 years. And in general, population growth is likely to be a more important threat than something like climate change. And if we look in the areas where our most destructive fires have occurred this year, certainly it's important to realize these areas have always had big fires, but they're now really damaging, and that's in large part due to the fact there's just more people on the landscape and more people vulnerable to these conditions. And this is illustrated by the 2017 fires that occurred in the Bay Area, Napa County in that area. There were a number of fires. These occurred during these north wind events. They're very similar to Santa Ana winds. They're driven by high pressure cell to the east and low pressure cell off the coast, and you get airflow, which is what is generally described as offshore flow. And these fires, most all of them were started by power lines that were blown down during these severe wind events. And an illustration of the role that population growth has played in the impact of these fires is illustrated in this fire in 2017 called the Tubbs Fire, outlined in black here, burned all the way down into the town of Santa Rosa. And what was interesting is 50 years earlier, there in 1964, there was the Hanley Fire, illustrated here by in red. And it burned more or less the same landscape, although it was much larger fire than the Tubbs Fire. It was also driven by Santa Ana winds. What was interesting is in the Hanley Fire, there were no fatalities and only 100 structures were lost. 50 years later, there were 22 fatalities and over 5,000 structures lost. And if you look at the population growth of Santa Rosa between 1964 and 2017, there was a 5-fold increase in the population of that landscape. And it was also reflected in development. This is the outline of the 1964 Hanley Fire. The tan represents low density development. This is the 2017 Tubbs Fire, and now the low density housing covers well over half of the area of the 27 Tubbs fire. And certainly that increase in development produced situation with many more people at risk to fire. But more importantly, it also increased the possibility of a fire, because all of these wind-driven fires in the autumn are all started by people, either directly or indirectly. Put more people in the landscape and you have a greater likelihood somebody somehow will start a fire, uh, either directly or through power line failures. Now, the second P to focus on is to point out that rather than being concerned about fuel treatments, we need to put a much greater emphasis on fire prevention. Progress has been achieved. Ignitions have declined markedly since the 1980s. However, area burned has remained high. Uh, and what that tells us is we're making progress on eliminating ignitions, but we're not eliminating the most important ignitions. For example, in the last decade, the majority of large fires have been ignited by power line failures. And to illustrate this is uh, shown by thinking in terms of the Santa Ana winds in our region. And here we see the a 70-some year record, 1948 to 1983 in blue, and then 84 to 2018 in red. And what we've plotted here is the percentage of Santa Ana wind events during that period of time where nothing was burned. There were no fires, compared to areas where there were different classes of fire events. And what we see is almost three-fourths of all our fires, or excuse me, three-fourths of all our Santa Ana wind events have no fire at all. And the reason is because nobody started a fire. If we can prevent fires during Santa Ana wind conditions, we will go a long way to eliminating this possibility of extreme or events. And I'll just point out, even if we focus just on the extreme Santa Ana wind events, we still see that we can get extreme Santa Ana winds and we don't have any area burned because nobody started a fire. So the critical thing to think about is the ignition sources, because that ultimately determines whether we have a big fire event. And this is just another way of looking at this by uh, modeling the amount of area burned based on all the parameters that are likely important, like ignitions, Santa Ana wind maximum speed, drought, etc. And what we find is the most important driver in all of these months where we look at, this is over a 70-year period, we look at the most important driver is the number of ignitions. If people don't light fires, we don't get Santa Ana wind-driven fires. Now, what is the source of source of the fire events? Well, under Santa Ana wind conditions, certainly in the last 35 years or so of record, which is in red, the primary source in Southern California for Santa Ana wind-driven fires is power line failures. The other important driver is arson. And that's quite different than, say, summer fires. This is area burned during summer fires is due to a diversity of ignition sources, both natural lightning fires as well as human sources. And an important thing to recognize about these power line ignited fires in California in the last 25 years, 5 times more areas burned than in the previous 25 years. So what we're seeing today is a major ignition source due to power line failures, and that is certainly has to be a focus of how do we deal with future ignitions. Now, when we talk about eliminating ignitions, I know a lot of people will say, well, you're never going to stop all the ignitions. And I would have to agree that maybe we won't, but perhaps we should take what I think of as a two-tiered approach. And the tier one is we recognize there are days that are extremely dangerous, what the fire agencies call red flag days. These are often equated to Santa Ana wind events. They comprise a very small percentage of all days. We should have a focus on trying to eliminate all ignitions during red flag days. And this includes not just power line failures, although there is a lot of effort going into programs to eliminate power line failures. All three of the major utility companies in the state are working aggressively on this problem. One of the approaches is what they call the PSPS program, which is the Public Safety Power Shutdown Program, where when wind speeds exceed a certain threshold, then they shut the power grid off in that area. Another approach is underground lines. So there are things power line or power companies can do to address this issue. And a big question is are they doing enough? And if we're still getting power line failures, starting fires, then the answer is perhaps not. Another is arson, big cause of fires during red flag days. And one of the approaches some communities have done is to have crews they call fire watch crews that patrol areas, and not only to catch arsons, but to discourage them from starting fires just by their presence. And then there's a lot of other approaches to how to eliminate ignitions during red flag days. There are certain power equipment restrictions. A lot of people use power equipment, have no idea there are such restrictions. But during red flag days, there are certain restrictions. Same with restrictions on burning. And then tier 2 is all other days. We should reduce ignitions. And primarily, we need research on the practices that work to reduce ignitions. Now, the third P is we need a much better developed system for predicting wind patterns and communicating to agencies and homeowners about what to expect when we get these wind-driven events. For example, the Camp Fire that destroyed a lot of the town of Paradise, there was a lot of concerns about the lack of adequate communication to the town of Paradise, and that resulted in massive losses of lives and homes. Eaton Fire, perhaps another example. The Eaton Fire entered the urban area on the eastern edge, but most of the mortalities occurred on the western edge. It certainly raises a question of whether communication was adequate in dealing with that fire event. Another P, the fourth P, is planning. We need to do better community planning when it comes to producing new developments. This is something that's been taken very seriously by communities in the past when it comes to earthquakes and floods. We have zoning restrictions. Fire historically has been perceived as a controllable disaster, but history reveals that we are vulnerable to fires too. And so there's a need for a greater focus on fire zoning and consideration of replacing community planning with more regional planning that takes into account fire zones. And then the last P is fuel treatments around homes. We need to focus fuel treatments on the house out. In other words, the greatest effort when it comes to fuels is not what you do on the landscape, it's what you do near the home. And the greatest effort needs to be put on those areas within 100 feet around the homes. And there's a lot of websites out there. Here's a website here at the top that gives a lot of suggestions on how, and this is specifically designed for the Santa Monica Mountains, on how to produce what they call defensible space. And that site is also valuable because it not only produces or gives you information on how to produce defensible space around your home, but the way to landscape your home, particularly using native plants, as well as understanding characteristics of the plant. In other words, that's a really valuable website that's worth looking at. Another website that's definitely worth taking a look at is this CAL FIRE website called Defensible Space. And they talk about how to produce defensible space around your homes. And one of the important things they tell you is there should be zones around your house that have different characteristics in terms of vegetation. In particular, the area adjacent to the home should be a hardscape, should not have vegetation growing. One of the fire managers in the Santa Monica Mountains, now retired, used to always tell the audiences that you should produce plants, or you should only have plants that you can see from your kitchen window. In other words, you don't want anything right below the window. You want things out away from the window. And this is just an illustration of one of those defensible space areas where you have hardscape next to the house, but plantings away from the house. And here's an illustration from that website of what happens when you have plants growing right next to the house, or you have a wooden fence right next to the house. And in this example, they threw embers onto this landscape. And here you can see the plants growing next to the house, carrying fire up into the house, as well as the fence and other things. And ultimately, this structure here was completely destroyed. So it's important to understand you don't want things next to your house, whether it's plantings or a wooden fence or a wood pile or whatever. And then another important thing to recognize about defensible space is it doesn't necessarily mean you should have total clearance. There's actually a downside to totally clearing an area, and that is that when the winds are blowing embers, they blow in a laminar flow. And if there's nothing obstructing that laminar flow, like here's an example here. This is a house from the town of Paradise, totally destroyed. It was completely cleared of vegetation. So I'm sure it would pass inspection as having adequate clearance around the house. But because there was total clearance, the laminar flow of winds carried embers right into that house. And so there is a downside to total clearance. And it has to be recognized that trees themselves can play a really critically important role. Here's an illustration. This is actually a relative of mine who lived in the town of Paradise. And this is his two-story home. And I visited him after the campfire, and his home was intact. And one of the characteristics of his house is it was completely surrounded by conifer trees that were had relatively moist vegetation. And I would surmise that these trees probably played a really important role in terms of preventing ember flow from reaching that house. So we don't necessarily want to focus on total clearance around a home. That trees, at least the particular type of trees, is important, could play a role. And here's just an illustration from Paradise, the campfire. Most of the homes, there were something like 18,000 homes destroyed during the campfire. And even though many of them had good clearance around the homes, the embers still took out the homes. But here's an illustration from Paradise where there were green trees around this home that was not destroyed. So unfortunately, this is just anecdotal evidence. We don't have good scientific evidence that this is a real phenomenon. Just one more illustration of the potential role that trees play. This is a community in the town of Paradise after the campfire. And most all of the trees, or excuse me, all of the homes in this community were totally destroyed. There were a number of homes that survived. And it's quite possible that the trees themselves, which you'll notice, the trees are all green. The trees weren't destroyed. It was the homes that were destroyed. And the winds came in from the east. And it's very likely that those trees pushed the embers up and over these homes near the eastern edge. And that may be the reason why those homes survived, whereas most all the rest of the homes in the community were destroyed. Another example from the Eaton fire, and I particularly appreciate this scene because I used to live, this is on Calavera Street in Altadena. I used to live in this house here. This house and the house next to it survived the Eaton fire. And one could surmise that it perhaps was due to the role of these trees acting as ember catchers, preventing the embers from reaching the homes when almost all of this landscape around here was totally incinerated. Now, the last thing I'll just point out is most homes burn from embers. They don't burn because the fire front reaches the home and ignites it. And so there are things you can do to your home itself to harden it against those embers starting a fire. One of the most widely cited improvements one can do to a house is changing the eaves around your house. This is what is called open eave construction. This is what's called closed eave construction. And the primary difference is where the vents are in the home. In the open eaves, the vents are here and the wind flow is coming from this direction. And it potentially increases the chances that embers will enter into the attic, which very often is where a lot of homes are first ignited, is from embers getting into the attic. Um, if you have open eaves like this with the vents oriented in this direction, there are things you can do by changing the mesh size of those vents to prevent embers from getting in. But if you have closed eaves like this, embers have to go in this direction to get through the uh, vents. And so closed eaves as a construction method is certainly preferable in terms of reducing fire losses. Another important characteristic to think about is around your home is the trees that grow around your home. And this is a study we did a number of years ago where we looked at pre-fire imagery from Google Earth and we measured the amount of clearance around a home, the amount of tree canopy that overlapped the home, tree cover around the house, whether or not there was a patio, whether or not there was a wooden deck. And then we measured the homes, or we looked at the number of homes that were burned versus unburned. And what was interesting, there was only one of these characteristics that was very highly significant. And that was the tree canopy overlap. And when you look at the aerial imagery, the trees that overlap these homes didn't themselves burn. But what they likely did is they dropped litter on top of the roof, and that accounted for why tree canopy overlap played a big role in whether or not a home was lost due to fire. In other words, if you have trees hanging over a roof, this is what the roof looks like. When embers land on that litter, they're very likely going to ignite the house. So that's something to give some thought to. And one of the things that you perhaps can do if you have trees hanging over your roof is at the beginning of the fire season, get up there on the roof with a blower and blow off that litter. And then the last thing I'll just point out about is this issue of rooftop sprinklers. Some people have suggested rooftop sprinklers. Perhaps Richard Nixon was the first to think about this. This is a classic photo of him in the 1961 Bel Air fire up on his roof with a hose sprinkling down his roof. Some people, though, have proposed more sophisticated approaches to sprinklers. For example, putting a sprinkler system on your roof that will keep the roof moist when a fire comes through. The sort of requirements needed for a rooftop sprinkler is, first off, you have to plan ahead. You have to have some sort of power source because the utility company is likely to shut down the power during a fire. So you have to have a solar power source. You have to have a water source because the water lines may get obstructed. So you have to have a private water source. You have to have a directional spray on your roof that avoids high winds blowing the sprinkler, the water onto someone else's house. And then there's also a potential financial cost. So those are some of the things that one can do in terms of dealing with future fires. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. I am looking through the chat, and I think maybe we'll start with there are questions about privacy hedges, zone zero, and the idea of the 100-foot area, because most of, what we're dealing with in Brentwood are, a lot of lots that are small. You don't have the opportunity to, have. So when you say clearing 100 feet, it's managing the fuel load for 100 feet, correct?
Yes, I didn't really go into details of what should be done beyond the 5 feet around the home. The 5 feet around the home is the most critical feature. Beyond that, clearance is not what is needed. And although very often um, fire managers will tell you you need to clear 100 feet, that's not exactly the best way to describe what is needed. You don't need to clear 100 feet. What you need to do is produce widely spaced vegetation so that the fire is not carried from plant to plant. And usually this is described as having plantings that are at least 30 feet apart. So you don't need to clear out to 100 feet. You just need to have spacing so that the fire does not spread from plant to plant. And the primary value of this 100-foot clearance is really going to be to provide defensible space so the firefighters feel safe enough to go in and try and fight a fire. Because fire people look at these homes from the perspective of how safe it is to try and protect them. I've been on tours with firefighters before, and they'll point out, this home is one we would never attempt to even save. It's just too dangerous to go in there. So it's important to recognize that the clearance out to 100 feet is to produce space so that there's not continuous fuels and provide a safer environment for firefighters to stay and protect the home.
Wonderful. So there are questions in the chat about, succulents in that 0 to 5 foot space. And, I know that I've done some, reading that has discussed well hydrated plants in the 0 to 5 foot. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, if you talk to firefighters, they'll tell you don't plant anything within 5 feet. Succulent plants aren't likely to burn. So yeah, you could get away with having succulent plants right around your house. The most important thing to understand, though, is how do homes burn? And they burn from embers. They're not burning usually because something ignites the home. It's adjacent to the house. It's usually because embers get either through the vents, or if there's high velocity winds like Santa Ana's, they can actually blow through windows. And so double pane windows are generally recommended for homes as a way of preventing the winds from knocking the window out and allowing embers. Once those embers get in the house, the house is usually a goner. So you want to make sure there's no easy way for the embers to get in the house. Double pane windows are one feature, and fine mesh screen in the vents is another means. And those are probably more critical than anything else.
So I want to actually unmute some people and give so I see
Emily,
here.
can I just
Sure.
ask a quick question before we go to Diana? Because I would like to hear from Diana as well.
Yes, and Travis Longcore as well.
Okay.
And Marianne King.
My question to you, Dr. Keeley, and hearing you talk about this, it sounds like, and we've had it in the chat, the homes on the Alphabet Streets and the Palisades fire, I don't even think they had 100 feet to clear. They're so closely spaced together. And you've talked about, increase in population. We have people in our state legislature that want to put more houses in these fire zones, taller buildings, more buildings on the same lots that we have now. Do you consult with any of our elected officials? Are you ever sought after to talk about the best way to plan in an urban wildland interface? And if not, can we somehow get you in that role?
Well, I work for the federal government. This is not a good time to get me involved in Um, there's no question one of the most critical elements in terms of fire spread is housing density. When you have high density housing, you are immediately at risk. A good illustration is the fire that occurred at Sylmar, I don't know, 5 or 8 years ago. Um, Time goes so fast. I usually have to multiply those numbers by 2 to get close. But there was this fire in Sylmar, burned through this trailer park area, very high density. Same thing happened in the Tubbs fire in 2017 in Santa Rosa, the community at the south end of that fire, very high density. When you have high density housing, um, it's it's really questionable what you can do to prevent the fires from spreading. And what is really critically important for people to understand is when you're in high density housing, you can do everything you want to harden your house, but it will make very little impact if your neighbors aren't doing the same thing, because the fires are spread by the fuels of houses adjacent to you. And those houses produce incredible fire intensities. And so once a house gets ignited, if it's near another house, that other house probably doesn't matter what you've done to the house in terms of hardening it, it's probably a goner. So high density housing, you are critically at risk in terms of losing your house if the fire gets in there and even ignites one of those homes, because they're likely to ignite the rest of them. So if you want to do anything to reduce catastrophic fire events, that would be reducing density of homes.
All right,
But
thank
that's
you.
that's a critically difficult question,
Yeah.
in an environment where the population is growing and nobody is talking about reducing population growth. Nobody's for reducing population growth. Certainly, it's the fundamental aspect to our economic system. You have to grow. So it's hard to get people to talk about issues like reducing housing densities, because where are you going to put people if you don't increase the density?
Well, I think too, it's about urban planning, and we don't seem to plan anymore. We do spot planning. And I think the other issue is Palisades now has an opportunity to rethink how they rebuild, right? Should you have so many houses? And I don't know what's going to happen or what they'll decide, but people have their lots and they're going to want to build on those lots. So someone has
Yeah.
recommended that, people, buy 2 lots and build on that. But anyway, that's a different kind of conversation. But um,
Well, the planning issue is a really important issue. And
yeah.
it's something that has not been given sufficient attention. For example, there was a proposal that was put forth in the assembly a few years back to change housing densities to reduce fire hazard. And unfortunately, the governor wouldn't pass it. And the primary reason, I assume, is because he's concerned about economic situation. And when you start doing anything that's going to increase the cost of a home, you're going to lose politician support. And so it's hard to get people on board. For example, there's a lot of suggestions about ordinances to increase home hardening, but supervisors in a lot of districts are reluctant to pass them because it increases the cost of the housing. And you can't blame them, because they're concerned about finding places for people in their community to live, and they know there is a threshold of what they can withstand in terms of costs. And so they're really faced with a difficult situation. They're dealing with a situation of increasing population growth and houses that are increasingly more expensive. And how do you balance that without sacrificing something? And very often that's fire protection.
Definitely.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. So I'm going to
Um,
ask Diana to unmute herself.
yes.
Diana, I just asked you to unmute. You should be able to unmute yourself to ask her question.
I thank you, Thelma. Um, Dr. Keeley, I've been orienting myself to your work and Alexandra Sahar's work as well. So I'm so appreciative that you're here and making yourself available for this meeting. And Travis Longcore has something in the chat, and I'm going to make sure if Travis doesn't have an opportunity to ask this question, I will ask it. But because he stole my question. But I really am, first of all, I want to say this. We have focused so many decades, since the 1960s, on plants being the problem. So I'm so grateful for your work and what you're saying about the structures are the fire's fuel, really. And so therefore, it's been politically easy for our politicians and our electeds to focus on the plants instead of on the real issue, which is density. I would say that when we're talking about our high fire zones, our severe high fire zones, that it shouldn't be politically hard, at least in those areas. And there's other places in the city where we could densify and build more vertically to produce housing. In fact, the last thing we want to do is put people of modest means or lower means, disadvantaged communities in a situation where they would lose their home and be homeless because they're not wealthy and don't have the means to get through this. I wanted your thoughts on a couple things. First of all, given that, I'm particularly troubled by websites like sustainabledefensiblespace.org, which is produced by a CAL FIRE grant that focuses very much on no vegetation around the home. I will say doing this work in landscaping that I've been doing for years, ecological land care and landscaping, I am encountering situations where all I have is 30 to 50 feet around a home because we have so much density here. And if I were to follow those guidelines on websites like defensiblespace.org, I would be left with almost no plants. In fact, I'm put in a position to remove plants from people's landscapes to follow those guidelines. And in some situations, that 5 feet is almost everything around a property. Because remember, it's not just 5 feet from the structure, but we're saying 5 feet from, or 5 feet from the house, but 5 feet from any structure. So somebody could have a storage unit. Maybe it's not a structure they're living in, but maybe it's an ADU. So it's particularly difficult in our situation, and I'm very troubled by us telling people not to have vegetation around their house in the city. And I feel like we're not recognizing the difference between a dense environment and doing defensible space out in areas where properties have much more space, like the urban wildlands intermix. So I was curious about your thoughts on that. And then Travis, I want to make sure, since it relates to that, Travis's question here, which was, do we have any actual post-fire evidence that no vegetation in zone 0 reduces structure loss? Other than, those storage units that we see where, they've stuck them out in a field and blew a torch at them. But Travis is actually about actual post-fire evidence that no vegetation in zone 0 reduces structure loss.
Okay, so Dr. Keeley?
Well, we do have data that we've collected on looking at the amount of clearance around homes and what impact it has on the loss of homes. And this was a large study done across San Diego County. And what we found is there was a significant reduction, maybe 25% reduction in housing losses when you increased the fuel treatment or clearance from 25 up to 50 feet around a home. But beyond 50 feet, we could find no significant difference. So it really didn't matter if you did clearance, beyond 50 feet, up to 300 feet in some cases, made no difference. But the important thing to understand is that most of our homes don't burn because the fire front burns up to the house and ignites it. They burn because of embers getting into the house. And that has to be the number one concern, is protecting your house from getting embers in there, because that's how the homes generally burn. The other concern that I have is a lot of the so-called wisdom about how to design landscapes to make them fire safe is not necessarily scientifically sound. It's just based on conventional wisdom. For example, I've heard fire people say, well, you need to cut down all the trees around your house because the trees are a danger. Well, the evidence seems to be mounting that it's probably exactly the opposite. If you have the right trees growing around your house, it actually can protect your house from the embers that land on the house. And we're currently starting a project on both the Eaton fire and the Pacific Palisades fire to look at the role of landscaping and fire losses. I'm not certain this is the right fires to be doing this because the wind speeds were so severe that I suspect that, you know, most homes ended up burning regardless of what was around them. But that's there are a lot of fires that occur under less severe conditions where that might be a reality. But as I pointed out in a couple examples in the talk, we've seen places where there have been trees around the home and the home survived, like this house in Paradise, where, you know, all the homes around the outside of where the trees were all incinerated, but the home itself survived. And I, you know, surmise that it's potentially because those trees block the embers from ever reaching that house. So one of the things that has to be questioned and has to be looked at more in more detail, we need scientific studies to show what is the role of trees to home destruction. Is it helpful or is it destructive? And I would say, depending on the species, it could be very helpful. Pine trees, probably not a good thing to have around your house. Oak trees, on the other hand, higher fuel moisture, so that when embers hit an oak tree, those leaves in the oak tree are much moister than the house itself. I mean, houses are at equilibrium with ambient conditions. So if it's 5% relative humidity, the house is extremely dry and ignites readily. But the oak trees, they have roots. They bring water up and the foliage is relatively moist and can extinguish the embers when they reach the canopy. And so we actually need good research showing to what extent trees are a liability and to what extent they might actually be a benefit. And right now, all I have is anecdotal evidence that suggests they, depending on the species, they could be a benefit.
Thank you.
Thank you. There was, go ahead.
And I think it's 8:30 already, so I
Yeah.
think
Well,
And
Thelma, there
relative
were,
to the question I see, Ann
yeah, there were
Rubin,
more raised
Deodar
hands.
cedars were around the house that I lived in Altadena, and it didn't burn. So, yeah, I never would have predicted Deodar cedars were valuable, but it certainly seems to be the case for Christmas Tree Lane. The Deodar cedars all along there seem to survive just fine.
Thelma, there's, I wanted, Marianne King has her hand raised. I wanted to get her, and I don't know if there are more raised
no, well,
hands.
we're not, because we don't really have time to have
Oh,
everybody.
we don't? Okay.
It's 8:30, so we'll let Marianne ask her question, but please ask a question. And then I think from the chat, Dr. Keeley, there's a lot of questions about, you know, what's a good tree, and they hear that palm trees should go and cypress trees should go. And so maybe we can follow up with you. You can point us in the right direction if there's some literature where we can, you know, publish it.
Well, I'm happy if you just tell people on the chat box to send me an email, and
great.
I'll answer whatever question people have.
Fantastic. All right.
Thank you.
I will share that with everybody that registered. In the meantime, I'm gonna, Marianne, you can ask your question.
Hi. Thank you so much. Such a wealth of information. Really appreciate it. And I think, Thelma, you raised good question in the beginning, and that is, how do we get everyone on the same page here? So we have Cal Fire, we have insurance, the insurance companies, everyone with their a different input and their different authority, and it must be just overwhelming for people who have lost their homes or are trying to protect their homes. So that's my one thought is, how do we get all these agencies on the same page about this issue and high fire hazard areas? it's really interesting that I think CAL FIRE is now expanding after 2011. They're expanding the high fire hazard areas, and I read that in the paper, I think today or yesterday. I'm like, well, that's good. I think I'm not sure what the motivation is behind that, but I'd like to know more. And I really think at the end of the day, the density is an issue, and all these additional structures like ADUs on hillside communities is like, well, this just it's overdevelopment in hillside communities where in high fire hazard areas. Why do we allow it, and why should we allow it building back? And that concerns me, because you got a 4-foot rear yard, 4-foot side yard, more things in the way. It's complicated. I don't know how, anyways, I think there should be more defensible space as far as space from other structures. And I love the idea of tall trees. We're trying to save them. I'm on a community forest advisory committee, and that's our #1 goal, is to preserve these healthy, mature trees, and especially in these areas that have been hit hard, as long as it's safe so I can't wait for your study on that. So thank you for your time.
The one thing I might just point out, just as a way of giving a positive outlook on all this, is the important thing when talking to different representatives from different agencies is you want to make sure the focus is on Southern California, because if you talk about fire in California, you're not going to get a good response about what's appropriate for Southern California, because most people think of California begins from Sacramento northward, and they don't think much about the southern part of the state. A really good webinar to look at is a recent one, happened about 2 weeks ago, and it was basically all about fire issues in Southern California. There was the director of CAL FIRE, and there was also a brilliant talk given by Mike O'Connell from I'm having a real senior moment.
Okay.
The Irvine Ranch Conservancy. And he gave a brilliant talk. It's on this webinar. I strongly suggest that you go to that webinar. If you can't find it, send me an email. I'll send you the address. But the director of CAL FIRE was on there. He was in complete agreement, and I'm in complete agreement with most everything Michael had to say about fire, which was primarily focused on the opening statement was Southern California is nothing like the rest of the state. It has very different issues. And it was nice to see the CAL FIRE director was on board with that. He recognized Southern California is a totally different issue. And so the important thing when people talk about fire in the state, make sure that they understand that Southern California is nothing like Northern California. And whatever you say about Northern California and what's appropriate probably doesn't apply to Southern California. But send me an email and I'll send you that website.
Okay.
It's a brilliant webinar, I thought.
Was it with the IRC then, Irvine Ranch Conservancy put it on?
No, it was put on by the state of California.
Oh, okay.
And I can send you that.
Okay, great.
Website.
And what I'll do is I'll put it in our email update so people can have access to it. And
okay, yeah, excellent webinar to listen to.
Great, and everybody that's on the call, we've recorded this. We'll edit out the beginning with the troubles, and we'll start from the presentation, and we'll have that readily available on our homepage too, because I really appreciate Dr. Keeley. Lots of great information. And hopefully we have a lot of people here from Brentwood as well for the Palisades, so hopefully it helped clarify some things. I'm going to end the meeting. It's 8:38 unless any one of my directors has a very strong question they need to ask. Not a statement, but a question. Anybody want to raise their hand? I'll see you that way. Otherwise, we had 100 people stay to the end, so thank you. I guess that's it. Okay, so I will follow up with you, Dr. Keeley, and everybody. I posted your email in the group chat, so.
Okay, that's
You'll
fine.
You'll be getting
I get lots of emails, so it's not a problem.
I figured since you're giving it out and we know where to find you at UCLA, right? So,
Yeah, no problem.
Thank
Um,
you.
okay, really, thank you so much. We really appreciate
Okay,
it.
nice to be involved.
Yeah, no, and hopefully we can get you more involved. I know you work for the federal government, but maybe in your UCLA position, you can help us out with some information as we lobby for, better fire prevention. So thank you.
Yeah, it's a liability right now being with the federal government.
But when you retire and you need that consultancy,
Well, that's the nice thing about my age. I can retire anytime I want and it would be appropriate. So
right,
if
perfect then.
things get rough, I'll retire. But so far, I have too much more work to do.
Yeah, no, we appreciate it. So we'll hopefully stay in touch then. Okay.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Thelma, and I appreciate being involved.
No, thank you very much.
Okay, bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.